The Warriors have won 11 of their last 14 games and finally look like a team that is capable of contending this season. For the first time really since 2 years ago when they started the season 18-2 and looked like they were the favorites to win the championship that year. In order for a team to look the part of contending for a championship, you have to have at least one stretch in the regular season where you look completely dominant. You look like you've separated yourself from the rest of the pack. And the Warriors are finally showing signs that they're capable of that. And to be honest with you, I've had belief in this team all along. I believe that this team was going to win 65 games this season, and that's with the belief that they were still missing a viable piece that they still needed to pick up by the trade deadline or the buyout market. And they're still in that situation. But there was a really great roster that's been formulated all along that Steve Kerr has completely and utterly failed to take advantage of by playing nonsensical rotations, nonsensical combinations, and nonsensical closing lineups that are just fundamentally broken. He's closed games with 3 guards for a chunk of the season. Now, some of these problems are still going on to this very day. I'm going to identify for you in this video what 3 problems the Warriors still definitively need to solve to look like the absolute best version of themselves and being able to maximize the situation that they currently have. Needless to say, I also have 3 solutions to solve those 3 problems. So let me quickly identify for you what those problems are. Problem number 1 is the 3 guard lineups and the 4 guard lineups. Steve Kerr has a horrible habit of going way too small. Listen, there is context to the small ball lineups that the Warriors have won championships with, and it is putting guys in position in which they can still be very strong in the positions that they play. It all started with putting Draymond at the center spot, which shifted Harrison Barnes over to the 4 from the 3, and then keep Klay and Steph Curry at their natural positions. And they had what they used to call the death lineup. That was the death lineup. Why? Because Harrison Barnes was good enough to play the power forward position, hold his ground, be able to rebound, help Draymond Green where help is needed, and then you play a lineup that has a ton of switchability and a ton of ability from the offensive end of the floor. But you have to be able to do your job defensively and hold your ground against the respective positions that some of these players are at. And somehow, some way or another, Steve Kerr has brainwashed himself into believing that any old small-ass lineup can go and get the job done. It's preposterous. That's why early in the season, we would see lineups like Chris Paul at the point, Steph Curry at the 2, Klay Thompson at the 3. When they won the championships, Klay Thompson was never at the 3. But Steve has gone so far off the path that oftentimes these days, he's even willing to put Klay Thompson at the 4 and thinks that these small-ass, tiny-ass lineups are somehow going to work out. Small ball lineups have context. It is not easy to be championship caliber while running a small lineup. Basically, no team has been able to do that ever except for the Warriors. And they had a very specific formula. Number 1 is Draymond at center. He can play that position. He can guard that position. He can't shut that position down, but he can absolutely guard and hold ground well enough while the team dominates from an offensive standpoint. Same thing with Harrison Barnes. It's not that he was a fantastic power forward. He could play well enough where you can get a stop against a legitimate power forward and get the rebound over them and be able to regularly fight in that way. And as long as you can hold ground from a defensive standpoint, well, you can do a lot offensively. Obviously, it was no different when KD replaced Harrison Barnes. They still went to the same lineup. And certainly, Kevin Durant can play the power forward position next to Draymond. And then 2 years ago, they had Otto Porter Jr. Otto Porter Jr. Who thought that Otto Porter Jr. is a viable championship caliber piece? A piece that the Warriors could not only close with in the playoffs, but even start with next to Draymond. They did so in the final 3-4 games in the finals against the Celtics when Otto started for this team at the power forward spot. And Otto shot 50, 40, 90 in the finals. He's one of a handful of players that have ever done that. Otto also had the highest net rating playing next to Steph. GP2 and Otto had the highest net rating for the Warriors next to Steph in the playoffs. Not Draymond, not Andrew Wiggins, not Klay Thompson, not Jordan Poole. It was Otto and GP2. And this is the most insane thing to me about it all, is that the Warriors not only failed And this is what's really crazy to me about what the Warriors have done since then. Because they went and got a championship with Otto Porter Jr. playing a vital role for the Warriors. Next thing you know, the Warriors failed to re-sign him. The Raptors signed him for a 2-year, $12 million deal. The Warriors couldn't sign Otto Porter Jr. for $12 million for 2 years? Anyway, the team failed to re-sign him, let him go to the Raptors, and since then, they've never considered the fact that Otto was never replaced. Who is playing the closing stretch 4 minutes for the Warriors for the last 2 years? They don't know. They had Anthony Lamb doing that last season. No wonder things didn't work out. They tried to have JaMychal Green doing that. Absolutely not. He's a cone on defense. And then they tried it with Kuminga, a second-year player, a 20-year-old. Thought that that was good enough going into the playoffs last season. He ends up basically not playing at all. And then the Warriors are stuck playing Wiggins at the 4, Moody at the 4, and GP2 at the 4 to close games. Are you serious? How does the front office not realize this? I don't know. How does the front office not have the basketball mind to realize what the formula for their success has been all these years? And now they've just been going without it. So they're missing this critical fundamental piece, and then they get booted out of the second round last season. And then the same thing is happening this season, where they just can't find a closing lineup. If you look at what the Warriors have been doing in these fourth quarters, it is preposterously bad. Let me show you the numbers. Let me show you why the Warriors have suffered so many losses where the game came down to the final possession. Games where they've lost by 1 point, 2 points, 3 points. There are so many games like this that the Warriors have tricked away this season. I've lost count. Let me try to show you some of them right now. Now the key is to identify what these problems are, and I've identified them for you many times this season, but let me do it again. The 3-guard, 4-guard lineups that break up the core and the structure of their defense, which is why they've been hovering in the 23rd, 24th defensively all season long. At some point, they were the worst defensive team in the league. So again, problem number 1, Steve Kerr, 3-guard lineups, 4-guard lineups. Problem number 2, Dario Saric minutes, especially at the 5. What is the most important defensive position in the game of basketball? It is the center spot. That is why it is called the anchor spot. And if your anchor spot sucks, well, it's virtually impossible for you to have a good defense because you don't have somebody who can protect you in the paint. Isn't this basic basketball? This is just a fact no matter what level of basketball you play. Outside pickup games, high school games, D1, D2, D3. No matter what level of basketball you play, that fact is the same everywhere. The guy that you call anchor for your team has to be a good defender. But this raging lunatic of a person that calls himself a coach of some of the greatest basketball players that have ever played the game has been sticking Dario Saric at the 5 for over 50 games of this season. No lie. My words about Dario Saric will not do justice to how bad he's been for the Warriors. Even if Dario Saric has a clause in his contract that forces the team to have to play him a certain number of minutes because he signed for the veterans minimum. And if a guy like that is going to sign for the veterans minimum, well, he's going to want to make sure that he gets a certain number of guaranteed minutes by the team so that he can then go to another team next season and sign a longer term deal. This is a thing that the Warriors have been doing. They did it with Dante DiVincenzo last season, and they did it with Otto 2 seasons before that. So let me go over this again real quick. Problem number 1 is 3-guard lineups and 4-guard lineups that is compromising the structure of the Warriors defense. Problem number 2 is Dario Saric at the 5 and just Dario Saric minutes in general. Problem number 3, and again I tell you, all of these problems have been manufactured by Steve Kerr. Essentially what I'm saying is that these problems wouldn't exist if Steve Kerr just didn't do these crazy things. But problem number 3 is the closing minute situation. The Warriors have figured some things out for sure throughout the course of this season. Steve Kerr has managed to sit Klay Thompson, realize that Klay can't be a critical part of what the Warriors do for too many minutes. It's gotten to a point where Klay is now coming off the bench and he's not closing games a lot of the times. And basically, they're going with a reactionary approach in which if Klay Thompson is having a good game, then they're going to try to close with him. Otherwise, they're not. Okay, they've also put Kuminga into the starting lineup, Potts into the starting lineup, Kevon Looney has been taken out of the starting lineup. So there have been some permanent changes that have been really good for the Warriors. And Kevon Looney and Klay Thompson have done a really good job coming off the bench. And now Chris Paul has returned. So now he's also going to come off the bench. Now the Warriors have a whole bunch of players that have been closing games or starting games that are no longer doing so. So there's a very unique situation going on with this team in which they are one of the deepest teams that I've ever seen when it comes to a Warriors roster since the dynasty began. This is literally the deepest team that I've ever seen. Now, the strange thing here is that two things can be true at once, which is that they have viable pieces that are rotational pieces, and yet a bunch of these pieces are not good for the Warriors when it comes to the closing minutes. The four names that are questionable for the closing minutes are Potts, Klay Thompson, Jonathan Kuminga, and Chris Paul. That's a lot of names. But what do we do? Well, essentially, you have to identify certain things that are going on. There are many guys that are capable of starting for the Warriors. You could start Chris Paul, you could start Klay Thompson, you could start Potts, Kuminga, Looney. I mean, we've seen all of these guys in the starting lineup at some point. Even Moses Moody is capable of starting for this team. It doesn't mean that all of these guys are also capable of closing. The closing thing is the biggest deal of all. Let me show you again what the Warriors look like in the closing lineup situations in the fourth quarter. The Warriors are one of the worst performers in the fourth quarter this season. What is the point of being good for the first 3.5 quarters if you're going to suck in the final 6 minutes of the game? And you can't win any of these close games because of the things that you're doing that are not conducive to winning when it comes to the closing lineup. Now, let me quickly explain why it is that some of these pieces are not good enough to close. Let's start with Klay Thompson. Defenses of the other team gets tighter as the game closes. The other team is playing the best possible 5 guys that they can close the game with. The Warriors should be doing the same thing, but they haven't been. So when it comes to Klay, his game is predicated on getting open shots. It's harder to get an open shot in the closing minutes, so oftentimes you'll see Klay forcing up terrible shots just for the sake of getting a shot up. But it's contested, it's well contested, there's a hand in his face, and he's still chucking away. So that's a terrible option to close a game. On top of that, he's not what he was defensively. Sometimes he can be good in certain matchups, but in other matchups where he gets switched on to certain guys that are quicker than him, speedier than him, I mean, he's getting burned. He can't really guard the point guard position and the 2 guard position the way he used to anymore. He's actually more conducive to being able to guard guys that are in the post. So against a lot of matchups, Klay just isn't good enough to close on both ends of the floor. And then you have Potts and Kuminga, who have entered the starting lineup recently, and that's really good. That combination of players, Steph Curry, Potts, Wiggins, Kuminga, and Draymond, have an amazing net rating, and generally speaking, have played really well together. However, Potts is still a rookie, and as reliable as Potts has been, the dependability level from a defensive standpoint is still not good enough. And then you have Kuminga. Ultimately, I don't think Kuminga is a closer for this team. Kuminga is a scorer. He's an efficient scorer, and he scores really well next to Steph. And he's pretty well protected next to Draymond and Wiggins in the front court. But again, to close a game, you need to be a powerful defensive piece next to Draymond. Draymond, again, needs help. And unfortunately, Kuminga is not that help. Kuminga's defense is just broken when it comes to the fundamentals, when it needs to show up the most in the closing minutes of a game. And then you have Chris Paul, who is 39 years old, 6 feet tall. He has to play the point guard position that forces Steph Curry to play the 2. Steph Curry is also 36, and he's not a 2. 6'2", 6'3", Steph Curry should not be guarding the shooting guards of the Western Conference, shooting guards in general. The guy needs to be kept at point guard, and he needs to be protected by a bunch of strong defenders surrounding him. That's what should be happening. That can't happen when he's being forced to the 2. Now you have a backward tandem of a 6-foot guy and a 6'2" guy. And by NBA standards, that is an ancient backcourt. You don't close a game like that. So you have a weakness in the backcourt, and then let's say you finish the game with Draymond and Kuminga at power forward and center. Now you have a deficit there as well. So you have a deficit here, you have a deficit here, and you think that that's good enough to close a game. It's not. So what are the most viable closing lineups? The best defensive lineups are pretty simple. Okay, so I hope you understand that a guy like Chris Paul controlling the bench unit for the Warriors is an utter positive. Kuminga being a scorer throughout the course of the game and being really efficient in that role is really good for the Warriors. Potts being a Swiss Army knife for a majority of the game is really good for the Warriors. Klay Thompson coming off the bench and playing a powerful role in that way is also really powerful. And now the Warriors just have to figure out how to close these games in which these 4 guys that we just discussed are making massively positive contributions throughout the game, but you're relying on all of them a little bit too much at the juncture of their respective careers. So the Warriors have a buy committee situation where they can rely on so many different pieces, can do so many different things, where a whole bunch of guys are getting 20-some minutes per game. High 20s, low 20s, whatever. A bunch of minutes in the 20s. Starters, Pods, Kuminga, Wiggins, getting a bunch of high 20-minute games. Klay Thompson, Chris Paul, getting 20 to 25 minutes per game and playing an effective role. And then to close a game, here are the best closing lineups that I've come up with. Is Steph Curry, GP2, Wiggins, Draymond, and Trace. So now you have a big front court of Trace, Draymond, and Wiggins. You have an elite POA in Wiggins. You have an elite secondary POA in GP2, protecting Steph Curry. And obviously with Trace helping Draymond in the paint area, rebound the ball, help defense, rim protection, all around more size. Another lineup that they can look to go to is Steph Curry, Andrew Wiggins at the 2, Kuminga at the 3, Draymond at the 4, and Trace at the 5. You want better defense, you have to have some basic size. You can't lack in that department. Think about that first death lineup. Andre Iguodala, 6'6", Klay Thompson, 6'6", Harrison Barnes, 6'8", Draymond Green, 6'6", a bunch of 6'6" guys. It's not a bunch of 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", which is what's happening with the Warriors right now. And then you have a bunch of threes that are pretending they can play the fours. Not every three can play the four. There are some threes that can play the four. So until the Warriors are able to get an actual viable stretch four, they need to scrap the small lineups and just go with the right sized combinations. And again, Steve will not go to this, but this is also a viable option. Draymond at the 5, Guy Santos at the 4, Kuminga at the 3, Wiggins at the 2, Steph at the 1. That's another big lineup. Can play better defense, can rebound better, and these are critical things that you need to close a game. You also have to consider the screening ability of the guy at the power forward spot, because you need at least 2 screeners. Not just 1, 2. See, when you have Draymond in there next to these other guys, Wiggins is not a good screener. Kuminga is not a good screener. So now you're missing that extra screening component. It's one of the things that made Draymond and Looney still useful in that they're both screeners. But they don't have that with these smaller guys pretending to be the bigs that they're not. And Guy Santos at least is all about hustle plays. And screening is a part of that. So he can do that as well. You can also go to a Draymond, Guy Santos, Andrew Wiggins, GP2, and Steph lineups. Now, if you fix up the 3 forward situation where the power forward center tandem is correct, and you have some combination of Wiggins, Kuminga, GP2 at the 3 spot, now you can tinker with that shooting guard spot a little bit more. If you have the protection of Trace, Draymond, and Wiggins, then you can afford to go Klay and Steph, or Potts and Steph, depending on what's needed. You can even experiment with Chris Paul and Steph, as long as you have 3 viable forwards that are really strong defensively for you. You see how that works? Now this is where Otto Porter Jr. comes into play, because he is available. I don't know why this hasn't happened yet, but the Jazz have offered Otto Porter Jr. to be bought out of his contract so that he can go join another team, because the Jazz are on some other thing. They're trying to rebuild, play young guys and whatever. There's no room for Otto to play. There's no reason for him to play. And that being the case, hopefully the Warriors have been in communication with Otto in some way, because they still desperately need a player like Otto. We're talking about Trace and Guy Santos right now, because that's the best options that are available to the Warriors at this juncture. If they had Otto, well, Otto would basically come in and essentially take over all of the Dario Saric minutes. Imagine that. Imagine not only that, but Otto can close games and make the Warriors a bigger team, a stronger team from a defensive standpoint, from a rebounding standpoint, from a stretchability standpoint, from an all-around high IQ play standpoint next to Draymond. And then they can go with that closing lineup that they had 2 years ago. Draymond, Otto Porter, Andrew Wiggins, GP2, Steph Curry, Draymond, Otto Porter, Wiggins, Kuminga, Steph Curry. Or even how about Trace, Draymond, Otto, Wiggins, Steph. How many powerful combinations can the Warriors formulate if they bring in a guy like Otto? He's literally the piece that would complete this roster that can actually and truly be viable to contend for a championship this season and be the favorites. There's still a path for this to happen. But there's only about 2 days left. Today is the 28th. The deadline is March 1st. Otto has to be bought out, and he needs to go to the Warriors. I mean, honestly, that's where he belongs. He won a championship with them. He should have never went anywhere else. The Warriors found a guy that helped them win a championship and then let him go for some youth movement. You see how jacked up the situation is? But they are truly in a unique spot where they can correct and right their wrongs. Last season, they let go of GP2 as well, by the way. And somehow, some way or another, they rectified that situation by bringing him back by the deadline last season for guess who? James Wiseman. So GP2 has made a comeback. Otto can also make a comeback, and his presence on the Warriors would automatically scrap the 3-guard stuff. The Warriors will probably never close with 3 guards ever again because Steve will absolutely play Otto if he's on the roster. So then you know that he will play Draymond, and you know that he'll play Otto and Wiggins. That's 3 forwards right there. 3 super reliable forwards that you can absolutely close just about every single game with. And all these losses they've had, 1-point loss, 2-point loss, overtime loss, all this stuff, all of those would be victories if Otto Porter was still on this roster. All of this would automatically help solve the 3 problems that I mentioned. The 3-guard, 4-guard lineups automatically go away if Otto is also a part of the equation. Problem number 2, Dario Saric minutes at any spot. All of those minutes can go to Otto Porter Jr. Boom! Done. Closing lineups. We just talked about it. Done. Otto Porter Jr. helps solve all of these problems automatically just by his presence alone. Now, there were plenty of other names that I had interest in to play that vital closing stretch 4 minutes for the Warriors. But there is no name that is more intriguing than Otto because the Warriors literally have a history of winning a championship with the guy. And he's right there for the taking. Otto, what are you waiting for? Get bought out and go to the team that you belong, win another championship, have 2 under your belt, and hopefully this time the Warriors will find a way to keep you. And even if somehow Otto decides to go to another team again because he'll be a free agent after this season, I mean, how many more teams are going to be way more interested in you if you're a part of a championship team again versus sticking with the Jazz or even just joining other teams? Why join another team when you can join the Warriors knowing exactly the role that you're going to be playing for this team because you've been there already? So we got to keep our fingers crossed, hoping for the best. By the buyout deadline, we'll see what happens. Should that not happen, it'll be a much harder path for the Warriors to be able to win a championship this season. Even if Guy Santos and Trace are options that the Warriors can go to, we don't even know if Steve will ever go to that. But even if they do, at the end of the day, Trace is still a rookie. Guy Santos is still a first-year player in the NBA. He's been called up from the G League. These are the players that we're going to rely on to try to win a championship? Come on, Mike Dunleavy, Joe Lacob. Recognize the situation that your team has and go make that final move. Do not cheap out on this situation. Get it done. Get it done, and I just about guarantee that they're going to win a championship this season. Anyway, thanks for watching. Plenty more content to come. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Be sure to subscribe, hit the like button, the notification bell, leave me a comment, all that good stuff. Until next time.